Greetings. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this session on how the pandemic, the recovery is looking from perspective of African policymakers. Yesterday, the IMF released its latest World Economic Outlook and the economic growth projections that it contains. And the sort of headline message, if you've been following it, has been that at the global level, this year is going to see an even stronger recovery than before, with the world economy growing at 6%. Some parts of advanced economies growing over 5%, the US growing over 6% this year. And East Asian countries, particularly the emerging markets in East Asia, China, India, all showing very high rates of growth. Of course, it's important to recognize that this is a rebound as much as a recovery. So when you look out 2 years from now, then the rates start to come closer to what they have been in the past, but certainly a very strong recovery. And this recovery is really driven by two things in particular, one being the progress that is being made in vaccination campaigns and then dealing with normalizing, if you like, economic activity, and then supported by quite strong continuing fiscal support from governments, big spending packages or big packages in terms of providing support to firms and to households. And so that those two things are driving this big global recovery. But I think the IMF also had a second message, which was a risk, a warning of a dangerous divergence, because although the aggregate numbers look very strong, when you start looking at countries or groups of countries or regions, you don't see the same pattern everywhere. And today we're going to be focusing on Africa. But if you look at Latin America, you see a little bit the same picture, which is a much slower, more faltering recovery. And in Africa also, and I'll just kind of stop myself there to say that when I say Africa, within Africa, there's going to be a lot of divergence. We'll get into that. But if you look at the continent as a whole and you look at the numbers, you see growth rates for sub-Saharan Africa that are really about half of what you see for some of the emerging markets and even some of the advanced economies. And that's also a reflection of, again, the same two drivers of strong growth elsewhere are not as present yet in many countries in Africa. Vaccination campaigns just barely getting started, and we'll find out a little bit more about where we are on that. Also, the ability of many of these governments to provide the kind of continuing fiscal stimulus, the support to their firms and their households, much more constrained. What financial reserves they had, they used up a lot of them last year. This year, actually, in some ways, the pandemic second surge, third round variants have come in and hit many of these economies harder, and the reserves are not there, financial reserves, to cope with them in the same way. So that's the angle that I want us to explore a little bit today with a very distinguished group of policymakers from Africa. And I'll introduce them as they come online. But I really wanted to turn first to Vera Songwe, who is Undersecretary General of the UN and Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, and has a very good overview of the region. So, Vera, I was thinking we might start off really by asking you kind of how does the recovery look? How does dealing with the pandemic look? How does the pace of vaccination look? Not from where I'm currently sitting in Washington. I sort of have a view of the world, which is trying to focus on the world, but sitting here, and you're in Addis, and you're very much in the center of what's going on in Africa. From where you sit, What would be your narrative today in terms of the global and regional outlook focusing on Africa? And you're on mute, Vera. Guys.
Thanks, Masood. Thanks. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody, wherever you may be, and thanks for joining us. This is an important week, of course, as the big World Bank IMF meetings, and we thank the finance ministers that are going to be with us for joining. I think, as you rightly said, I think there's two things happening in the world today. There is this incredible optimism from the recent IMF report that says, growth is going to come back, huge rebound. Everybody's talking about the 6%. As you rightly said, it is a rebound. So it may have settled in a year and a half at 4, or even 3, and it would mean that we went back to sort of advanced economy growth levels quite quickly. The second conversation is the divergence. As we talk about the sort of positive growth trends in the advanced economies, we're talking about a sort of larger split between the haves and the have-nots, if you want us to put it that way. And this leads me to the haves and the have-nots on vaccines. A lot of I think the positive growth that we're seeing in the advanced economies is coming from two places of optimism. One of them is the huge liquidity and fiscal stimuluses and monetary policy targets that we put in place to ensure that there was a floor that was put to the sort of opening up of the economies in the advanced economies. In the United States, almost 24 to 27% of GDP was injected into the economies in terms of stimulus. In Europe, 754 billion. In Japan, somewhere in the $700 billion. In China as well, in the trillions of dollars of stimulus was put into the economy. The central banks also, put in place quite a number of quantitative easing measures to make sure that businesses and the private sector could stay afloat. And so that's sort of, and the divergence is that in the advanced economies or in the developing world, we didn't see any of that. So the response to the crisis began to create the divergence that the IMF is talking about. So that's the first one. The African finance ministers in March of 2020 called for two things at the time. One was a suspension of service interest payments from multilaterals, private sector, and bilaterals. We got the bilateral one thanks to the G20 in the form of the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which has delivered $50 billion, $5 billion to the continent so far. But $5 billion is less than 2% of the economies if you add that to everything else that the African economies have done. And I think I want to come back to this point of what the African economies themselves have done. African leaders, acted very quickly to respond to this crisis, and maybe that has narrowed a little bit the divergence. But the IMF has come up with numbers that say that to close this sort of diverging gap between Africa and the rest of the world, we need $425 billion over the next 5 years to close that gap. So that's an important number because it's consistent almost with the $100 billion every year that Africa continues to ask for. The second part on the divergence is, of course, the vaccines. We've seen, as of today, there's some positive news. 45 countries on the continent have gotten some form of a vaccine, either through the COVAX facility, either through the African Union facility, or through donations. So 45 out of over 54 countries is quite a big number.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you just help us unbundle a little bit this vaccine number? Because I must confess that, I tried to collect the numbers on this and I still don't have a very good grip on it. So you're saying 45 countries have received now some vaccines.
Yes.
Of course, the numbers often that you see are contracts, which are going to be received over many months, maybe many years. And then there's a gap between the receipt of vaccines and the actual putting those doses into people's arms. And you see news stories of vaccines sitting in warehouses because the distribution systems or the other material you need to get them out or the human infrastructure isn't in place yet. So I want to get a little bit your take on what are the reliable numbers, as best as you can put them together, on where the vaccination campaigns now stand across the continent.
No, I think that's a very good question because, again, of the 45 countries that have received vaccines, as I said, 31 are COVAX, have received, grants or free vaccines from COVAX. 11 have gotten the AU vaccines, and 30 have received donations. And some of them have gotten all the three, right? The same country. 42 of those countries have started vaccinating. All these numbers sound very high, 45, 40, 42. But in terms of vaccines that have actually been administered, we're talking 12 million vaccines. 12 million vaccines in a population of 1.2 billion. If you say the target sort of vaccinable population is 500 million or even 400 million, then clearly you begin to see that we're at very, very low numbers in terms of sort of overall vaccines. Actually, when you look at how many people have gotten 2 vaccines, we're still at about 70,000. So we haven't even reached 100,000 in terms of, who has gotten a complete set of vaccines on the continent. So
we're talking 100,000, less than 100,000 people
are fully
out of a population of 1 billion plus,
exactly,
of which eligible population or priority population is in the upper hundreds of millions.
exactly,
Right?
exactly.
Just wanted to get that sense.
So that's the divergence. That's the second divergence, is that, we are not getting, so the numbers in terms of countries that have received a vaccine looks very high, but they've received, 5,000, 10,000, 90,000, almost a sort of token to say, yes, we've received something. But in terms of sort of the huge avalanche of 100 million, the African Union with the African Vaccines Initiative, AVAT, has announced a 277 million Johnson & Johnson procurement, but that will only start in August, ratchet up a little bit by December, and then really go into full gear in 2021. So there is still a risk that we close.
In 2022, you mean?
In 2022, sorry.
Yes.
There is still a risk that we close 2021 with less than 5% of, the African population.
So just let me put you a little bit on the spot on this. So, so end of this year, this is all best estimate. So we recognize there's a lot of uncertainty. You're saying maybe 5% of the population by the end of this year is going to have been fully vaccinated. Then we come to the end of the following year. And on the basis of what orders there are, what discussions there are, how confident are we that we're basically thinking of this being another year to complete the job, or is this actually even more than one more year? Are we talking about this process spreading out over the next 2 or 3 years before we get to that? Do we have any from your colleagues who are working on this? What's their take on it?
I think the best guess estimates, and we just had a meeting this morning, will be end of 2022 as the most optimistic end, and possibly into the early parts of 2023. But that depends on 2 or 3 things. The first one is a huge ramp up of availability of vaccines, because part of the problem is the lack of availability. The second is of course then the potential, and we've seen, the capacity to actually vaccinate and get that administrative process going. There's been hiccups in the US, in France, in Germany. And so I think, in this initial phase of vaccinations, we're going to learn from countries that have gone ahead. Seychelles is one of them. Morocco is another, that have actually done quite a number of vaccinations, to just understand. Rwanda, to understand a little bit, how have they organized the campaign and what is the easiest one. We're not being helped, of course, by the global conversations around, the anti-vaxxers and can that work or not work. So we hope that by the end of this year, a lot of that will have been put aside. People will understand it's good to get vaccinated. The systems will be in place to really start the vaccinations going, and then we can sort of start getting it done. But that's, I think, the second order of the divergence. Now the question is, can we close this gap on the divergence, and how do we do it? The IMF has given us a number, 425 billion, in terms of where we want to get to if we want to close the gap. And on the vaccines, we also have a number, 60% of the population needs to be vaccinated. So the good news is we know what the targets are to catch up. The second part of the good news is hopefully this week we're going to hear from the IMF that $650 billion of special drawing rights have been approved. Africa will get about 33.6 billion of those special drawing rights. So some injection.
Although these are very concentrated, the 33 billion, if I understand correctly, in a few countries. And if you take the sort of the
top five,
the big countries in the top five, the numbers become much smaller over many countries.
Exactly. Once you've taken out South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Morocco, and I think Algeria. Yes. Then you really get, which is why we are asking for on-lending, because then with on-lending, you have the capacity to have a lot more allocated.
I want to come in a minute, if I may, Vera, to this issue of financing and also to this issue of how you can access more market financing on better terms. And you know, you have a specific proposal, an idea that we've been exploring, so we should come to that. But a lot of people are asking, you know, well, okay, there are these numbers, 100 billion a year, but how will this money be used? How can we be sure that what will this money be used for? And if I may, I want to turn to Jean-Paul Adam, Jean-Paul is currently with ECA, but as many of us will know, he was a Minister of Trade and then for the blue economy for the Seychelles. And Jean-Paul, you've been thinking a lot about sort of what will the recovery look like? And there's a big discussion about sort of a green recovery, a more inclusive recovery, a less unequal recovery. What's your current take on how would that money fuel the kind of recovery in Africa that we would like to see 5 years down the road?
Well, thank you very much, Masood, and good afternoon to everyone. And it's a great pleasure to join this event. So firstly, we've done a Green Recovery Report, which has really highlighted what are the best ways in which African countries can respond to the challenges of COVID-19, but also at the same time build resilience to climate change. Because some of the issues that we've already touched on, why are we talking about divergence? One of the main reasons is the vulnerability of African economies. And unfortunately, this has been exacerbated in the context of COVID-19, and it will get worse as well with the impact of climate change. We estimate that African countries by 2030 will be losing between 2 and 5% of their GDP, but some African countries are already spending up to 9% of GDP in responding to climatic degradations that are impacting on their environments. So the need is very much to invest in areas that change the economic model for Africa, away simply from extractives, because the rebound in terms of growth just based on, for example, extractive-based commodity exports will not be sufficient. We need a deeper review of economic growth in African countries. And the modeling that we've done on 2 African countries, which are South Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo, have shown very clearly that you get a higher quality job creation and gross value added compared to if you invest in green sectors, which includes, for example, renewable energy, it includes climate smart agriculture, it includes nature-based solutions. You get a much better impact in terms of jobs and the value addition than if you're investing in fossil fuel-based sectors. And in South Africa, it was 250% more jobs in the short term and 420% more value added in the economy. In the DRC, it was slightly less pronounced, but still very, very significant. 130% more jobs in the short term and 280% more value added in the economy in the longer term. And African countries have actually already expressed the wish to go down this route. There is a green stimulus program that was adopted by the African Union in January. There are already 39,000 megawatts of announced renewable energy projects across Africa that are ready to go. And there's an investment opportunity of over $500 billion worth of investment in energy alone up until 2030 in renewables. So the problem, the missing link, has been the financing, and the financing at affordable rates.
Perfect. That's really helpful, Jean-Paul, because I think you bring us, and I hope that all the people who come around and make statements that there aren't enough projects that we can finance are listening to you. And we'll put up your email address on the screen at some point so they can contact you for more details on this. But I know that I believe Ken Ofori-Atta, the Minister of Finance for Ghana, has also been the chair of the Development Committee, has joined us as well. Ken, welcome to the Center for Global Development, this event that we're doing with ECA. It's always a great pleasure to have you. And you've listened to sort of Vera talk about the divergence that's happening between advanced economies and developing countries. The IMF's been talking about divergence in vaccines, divergence in financing, and Jean-Paul has just given us a very nice perspective on the opportunities that there are for investing in a more green recovery in Africa. And you have been, as I said, chair of the Development Committee all of last year, and then next week you'll be handing over that charge to the Prime Minister of Barbados. Financing has been mentioned in all of our conversations as being one of the limiting factors. And I want to really get a little bit your sense on that. And in particular, the two dimensions of it that I'm really very hopeful we can explore a bit more. One is, how well are we doing in mobilizing new financing, both from official agencies and from the market? So there's been a lot of discussion actually that the markets have been, a lot of liquidity, many countries are going there. And so is that something that from your perspective, how do you see the markets? Are there ways in which we could make market financing more affordable? And the LSF, the proposal, the liquidity support facility proposal that is out there is one very important initiative in doing that. And the second dimension I want to get a bit your sense on is how big of a problem is debt for African countries? Is it, as some people say, a really broad-based issue that's an important issue for the global community now to focus on this year and move beyond DSSI, which is this temporary suspension of debt service payments, and deal with debt sustainability? It needs a lot of concerted collective action to deal with it. Or is it, as others would say, it's one problem amongst many? It affects a few countries. We have a process in place, which is this common framework that the G20 have come up with. 2 or 3 countries are going through it soon. Maybe 3 or 4 more will go later. But that'll do the job. Let's kind of focus on making it work and spend our energies really on the things that are going to bring market-based financing to countries that don't want to get into this debt relief track, because it's actually counterproductive for them. And they really want to focus on how do you get market financing. And so I'm hearing both of these narratives at the moment. And actually, I would say I'm hearing both of these narratives from African policymakers as well, sometimes in the same meeting. And I want to get a little bit, Ken, you've got a very nice overview from your Development Committee perspective, but also from your own country. How do you see the financing and debt agenda going forward? You're on mute, Ken, sorry.
Thank you very much, Masood. It's great to be here. And it's I mean, the past 5 weeks have sort of really crystallized for me the issue we had, given my own sort of post-COVID experience at the Mayo, and realizing the nexus between, I guess, the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Health in this, very crucial period. But, you know, Masood, I really would like to literally congratulate the world because we seem, in a way, for the first time to be speaking one language. I mean, the discussions 6 months ago was the impracticality of SDRs, you know, China, you know, everything really seemed unclear over lack of any multilateralism. Listening to the G20 today and speaking was for me to, in a sense, congratulate us to have moved to a common language. And I think I was quoting Genesis 11, where the people tried to build a Tower of Babel. And because of the unanimity of thought and language, they really would have gotten to heaven if not for their bad intentions. So if our good intentions are to salvage where we are, then really we are on a platform that could resolve this issue. And Tharman did mention that, you know, we do have the capacity. You know, the question now is organizational and a willingness to continue. So, but then we are faced with, let's say, that the Vasan nationalism, which goes to, in a sense, the core of the financial architecture that we have, which then leads to the solutions that we are talking through. I mean, there's no question that when Africa moves from a 34% situation of debt to GDP to maybe 56%, there's a crisis on us between liquidity moving to insolvency. Now the total debt maybe that we'll be talking about, maybe 1 trillion. And truly, given the avalanche of liberalism that has been shown by G20, G7, there's $1 trillion of money somewhere to solve this issue, you know, to create a more stable development going forward. So I am a lot more confident about the movement forward, and that if we can really put together the coalition of the willing by the fall of next of the annual meetings, we should be able to find solutions for it. I know we have proposed an LSF, liquidity facility, and that can come in various ways. But when you look at the 650 billion that has emerged from SDRs, and we are going to get about 33 billion. That's about 5%. That does not lead to the core of solving the problem. And so we should be able to enhance that to maybe 25%. And I think that's an appeal from us. Secondly, the unused SDRs gives us much room to be a lot more liberal in how we tackle the Africa problem. And we should do that. You look at vaccines and you can see that the availability of almost maybe 9 doses, you know, 8 doses per person in the West, and Africa may have about 1 or half a dose for each person. So you see the inequality that can be resolved. So Masood, I guess for me, the question is whether we as recognize it as a global good that needs to be resolved. Resources are available. We are all beginning to speak the same language, and even moving further into issues of digitalization, which then in a sense would enable the multinationals and the non-geographic people to pay their due taxes. And then actual digitalizing of our economy that can become a structural imperative for the World Bank, so that we can also double our domestic revenue mobilization. I think there's the capacity to do it. I think people are beginning to put their minds to the inequity that it will bring, and then the contagion effect if you supposedly exclude Africa from it. The virus, it does not stay in one place. So yes, $1 trillion can be financed. We can be creative about it to create a much more stable world that would benefit everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. So you're definitely more optimistic than when we last spoke.
Mhm.
I think that the capacity was always there. Perhaps what's changed is that there is more of a recognition of the fact that we really do need to get out of this together for anyone to be fully out of it. Uh, we all sort of fell into the crisis at around the same time and in much the same way, but there was a brief period when I think people felt some people could come out of this and you didn't have to worry about the others. And now the realization is coming that that was just self-delusion. I think the other thing that probably has changed is that there is more of a willingness to try and find common solutions, and that common language you spoke of is really important. So I want to on the vaccine, on the pandemic response, I think everybody would sort of see the common good. This is a public good. You have to find collective solutions. Question is how you do it. I want to go a little bit more on the financing and debt, though. So on debt, I want to get your perspective on this, and then also Vera's. In terms of the way forward, is it essentially to keep moving forward with a few cases as they come up, using the common framework that exists, which is sort of one track that I would say the world at the moment is on? Or is it, this is the year when we should think broader, bigger, deeper, more systemic, which is another set of calls that you hear also coming out. And the people who call for that point out to the fact that, this is a bigger problem and numbers are manageable, but affect many countries. And the people who are cautious about that broader approach say, we have an approach, it's sort of working, let's get on with it. And many countries are very wary in Africa of a broader debt relief call, because the moment they have a discussion about it, they get a downgrade on their rating, and their access to markets becomes more expensive. So they don't particularly want it. But what's your take on it, Ken?
I mean, I think it's just sort of putting our head in the sand and not wanting to think beyond the reality of a pandemic that has brought a lot of people to a halt. I mean, if you look at, an American citizen, anti-communist, anti-socialist, receiving a check of $1,500 or $3,000 from federal government. I mean, obviously, you can't be sitting in a rating agency and then pretending that all is normal. I mean, that's just ridiculous. So the issue of, what I'd say, a tectonic shift in the global architecture is just present with us, 1943 to 2021, and we need to address it. I went to market Ghana's paper last week, and I think we got interest rate handles, sort of around 8% or so, choppy market. We were able to get 3 billion, which was 3 billion we did last year. So you can say that even in this market, there was some amount of liquidity, but the pricing had changed.
But at 8%.
At 8%.
So we talk about the world in which it's zero interest rates and we should borrow.
Exactly, or even paying to
8%.
deposit your money. And then you have a Greece going to market, maybe 100 basis points. So that then, even though you may have the same rating, somehow because of geography, there's an African premium, which is 500 basis points beyond. Now, how does that make the world more efficient? And the pretense that, well, this is the private sector. The private sector in the West is managing the pensions of individuals. So claiming that, well, it's a private sector and therefore let's leave it. So yes, I think it is time to fundamentally look at that architecture and say, you know, what is sustainable, what is durable, you know, for the future, to avoid these conditions or this the effect, the excess effect it has on countries in Africa, etc. And I think that's unlodging people to get away from this issue of moral hazard, etc., to say that this fundamentally is flawed, and what is the new architecture that will, you know, will help us in the next 50 or 60 years. I think it's what we have to calm our minds to. So there needs to be a certain coalition of the willing to really look at these months that are ahead of us, so that by the annual meeting, you know, something really remarkable would be brought to bear. I'm confident that, you know, we can, because you can see the IMF and the World Bank also rallying to be a voice. The issue of transparency and all of those things, those can be solved, you know, through digitalization and transparency. But I think we as a people just need to acknowledge that it doesn't work. It's not going to work, and that we should address it with entities like yours helping shape a direction that will be good for us.
So I want to thank you very much. I want to come back a bit to what role the IFIs can play in this in a minute. But this is actually a very nice segue. You said, you know, you're borrowing at 8%, give or take, in the markets. Jean-Paul was talking about a group of projects that were very viable, renewable energy projects. You can deliver solar maybe for 4 cents, but if you have to borrow money that brings in the risk premium of 500 basis points to finance those projects, that electricity is not going to cost 4 cents anymore. You know, so it's very hard to do sustainable long-term infrastructure on the back of 8% borrowing or a 500 basis point premium. It just doesn't. Projects just don't pay out enough for the investors. So that kind of brings me to this LSF idea, because, you know, the LSF is a concrete proposal, liquidity support facility, that is aimed at trying to bring down, in some ways, the cost of market-based borrowing as well.
But Mahmoud, hold on a second. I mean, because if you look at IMF, World Bank encouraging us to go to the market because the market supposedly will price you right. And then you already have a rating. And then suddenly you come to market and there's an African risk premium added to it because of geography. So is that a market response? And the same way in which, you know, Greece somehow has a shield because it's in the Eurozone, and the Africa Development Bank, you know, uses sort of the ratings of its non-regionals to be able to go to market. So it is clear that certain interventions are necessary even as you go to the market. And that is where the issue of the LSF and whatever it is we want to register should then help to make the market more efficient.
Exactly, and
that has to be recognized.
Exactly, and I think you know, this is what I want to come back to you on is once we've got Vera to come in, is to say, well, do you think that the development banks, the MDBs, you know, the World Bank and others, over the next 10 years should be doing qualitatively more to help with risk mitigation and mobilization of private money from the markets, but on much more affordable terms by acting on trying to reduce the risk premium than they have been doing, even if it comes at the expense of some of the direct financing that they've been doing themselves. So I want to come back to you on that. But Vera, maybe you want to come in at this point on the LSF as one way of trying to bridge that gap? You're on mute, Vera.
No, sorry, no, thank you. I think Ken, Minister Ofori-Atta could not have sort of teed it up any better. You know, he's just gone to the market.
I thought you had orchestrated this.
And he's just, I wish, but you know, he's just gone to the market. So clearly shows that the markets are open. And I think that the IMF has been saying that, you know, for countries that got into the crisis with good fundamentals, the markets are open. And that proves it. And it's not only Ghana, it's Cote d'Ivoire, it's Benin, it's Morocco, it's Egypt. So there's a slew of African countries that have gone to the markets. And I just want to pause there for a second and say that, you know, in March of 2020, when, you know, the minister and ourselves and many of us were talking, there was this sense that, okay, there's a crisis and African countries are going to start unraveling very quickly. I think the good news is that we are in April of 2021, and we haven't seen that kind of disorderly unraveling of the African economies. But this is because we got into 2020 with strong buffers and good fundamentals overall. But I think it doesn't matter who you were in January 1 of 2020, when this thing hit, everybody was in trouble. Everybody, good fundamentals, but everybody was in trouble. And I think actually the African countries, when you think about, you know, the kinds of fiscal and monetary stimuluses that have been injected into the advanced economies, and where Africans have come out, we have done really well. And I want to just take, you know, some time to say, you know, this was not what was expected, you know, almost 18 months into the crisis. Having said that, there's countries that are going back to the markets, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, at, you know, 7.5, 6.55. When we know that in Japan, there is a conversation about paying people to buy a Japanese paper. Is a little bit, this is the divergence that the IMF paper is talking about, is can we actually, you know, realistically live in a world like that? So the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility is saying what? It's saying, finally, you know, we're very happy, and, you know, Secretary Yellen is the force behind this, and you know, people do matter at some point in time in history. And she's come and totally changed the momentum around the release of SDRs, not only saying yes, but saying yes to a higher number. Everybody was at 500, we're at 650. And we cannot, I think this sort of spirit of optimism that the minister is talking about comes really from there, is finally we're saying some injection of liquidity is coming to the continent. But, you know, this happens once every decade, or once when there is a big pandemic. The last time we saw a liquidity injection like this was in 2008, 2009, and the global financial crisis. It mostly went to the advanced economies. So we're going to get a huge injection of liquidity, and hopefully some unlending of that liquidity. What do we want to do with it? Do we just want to take it and spend it? Or do we want to reinvest it so that it delivers even more sort of distance for us in terms of getting additional liquidity? And this is where the LSF comes in. And exactly what Ken was saying, that, you know, Greece can borrow because it has behind it the ECB. The African Development Bank has AAA rating because it has behind it the power of the G7 countries that sit on its board. If African countries like Ghana want to go to the markets, or Egypt, you know, that want to go to the markets, can we have the power of a facility or an instrument that provides them with some certainty in liquidity? So we're asking for some of the SDRs, somewhere in the order of $30 billion, to be put into a facility that allows us to be able to go to markets at much more affordable rates. We've done some calculations for Egypt, and there is no, you know, better performing country on the continent than Egypt, I think, in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But Egypt is going to the markets at, you know, 4 or 5 times the cost of Greece. And with a facility like this, you could save Egypt $500 million a year, or over the course of its bond, $2.7 billion. In an economy that needs to create jobs, needs to recover, we believe that this is the kind of facility that we should do. And, you know, I think that there is clear acceptance from the global development world that development resources are not going to develop the emerging market economies. We need to go to markets. The question is, how do you make access to markets more affordable and not a debt sustainability or sort of a debt trap? Because if you go to markets at 7, 8, 9%, chances are you are going to face a debt crisis problem, before long. If you go at 2-3%, you can actually sort of ride that wave for much longer. And this is essentially what the LSF is doing, but it's doing more than that. And I want to add this. So in the first instance, it's a liquidity facility to sort of reduce rates. And the idea behind that is to say, if you reduce the rates, you get more people buying African bonds, because this liquidity facility is going to act like a repo facility. It's going to make African paper more liquid, and so crowd in more investors. And that crowding in of more investors will also reduce the price of the paper. But over time, what we want the facility to do is actually support sustainable green investments in infrastructure, in ICT, focus on SMEs, provide the kind of working capital that businesses need to recover, because the liquidity part is just, sort of the response. But really what we need to do is move into the recovery, where we start recreating jobs, making sure that more people don't fall into poverty, and that those that fell into poverty can start beginning to see that there is a pathway out of poverty.
So I think that's really helpful. So I want to come back now to what role the IFIs can play in this. So Ken, if you had a blank slate and say, okay, this is what I think it would be really helpful to say an institution like the World Bank or other development banks to try and do things that would help to bring down the cost of market access for countries in Africa over the next 5 years. And if you were asking the shareholders of the institution to say, give some money to expand their financial ability to act, but this is how that money should be used. What would be your kind of mandate for them? What would be your instructions as to get that refocusing?
Thank you, Masood. As chair of the Development Committee, I think there were two things that I thought were important, and two things that would lead to sort of a structural change on the continent with regards to domestic revenue mobilization. Masood, I think Africa collects, close to $400 billion of taxes. But we are at about maybe 15-16%
right.
At best revenue to GDP. Digitalization, if it becomes a structural imperative for the bank, will lead to potentially a doubling of that, so that our own ability for sustainability comes through, and that is going to be important. The whole issue of jobs and economic transformation also as a structural imperative becomes important. Thirdly, I think the recognition of the whole digital economy in a sense, so that it's not about geography, but clearly we are able to get our fair share of taxes from these companies. Will give us those resources. So clearing the ills of the system itself is important. Then you look at the whole formulation of the SDRs and whatever money we want to give to the IMF, for example. And the question is whether the instruments that the IMF currently have are adequate to be able to resolve the PRGT, etc. And I think a little bit more innovativeness would enable that money to support an LSF or whatever else, our ingenuity will bring to bear. And that will lead to the type of transparency that we want. On the issue of then infrastructure, we are behind, maybe close to, according to the Africa Development, 100 billion deficit gap each year. Everybody is talking about green investments, etc. Carbon pricing is an issue that we should be able to take advantage of. how would that be strengthened so that Africa, which really is not contributing to that, will get paid for that. So on the climate change, carbon pricing will be important for us to look at for Africa. On looking at how new resources will be given to the IMF in getting instruments that will support an LSF, etc., are going to be critical. So those are the issues, and then sit down really with them for the IMF and World Bank to work with us to get a global coalition to restructure the current system that we have. So yes, there are some things we can do. They can help us do, which has to do with the issue of digitalization, etc., and jobs as a structural imperative, so that we create our own domestic sustainability. And also, as you know, we lose about 50 or 60 billion in illicit financial flows that could be eliminated with the new tax structures that are coming up. One, then looking at the global resources, what do we give to the IMF and lead to certain market access that we have. So that's my optimism, but it is going to take hard work and it is going to take organization. But I think people's minds are ready to maybe look at that. But you need to fight for everything. It's good.
No, I think that's absolutely right, Ken. Thank you. And I would maybe just say that it's interesting for me watching from the outside the discussions that you and your colleagues have been having this week to listen to the proposals on there being a minimum corporate rate of corporate tax around the world to avoid companies taking advantage of tax havens, that there is more willingness to talk about having a sort of expanded version of the work the OECD was doing on BEPS and on sort of looking at how corporations are taxed in different areas of their activity, and also a discussion, at least an idea being floated that there might be some kind of solidarity tax from both companies and individuals that have profited exceptionally during this pandemic. I mean, these are all ideas that I think, as you say, a year ago would have been difficult to see getting off the ground. So there is a substantive basis for that optimism, and I think a lot of those ideas are probably made possible because of changes in the political perspectives in some of the major countries. Vera, you wanted to come in on that point.
Thank you, Masood. I wanted there are 2 points. One, I think this sort of global solidarity is very important, and I think one of the things that's also happening, and we must give credit, is that some of the responses that are being formulated, yes, they may be a little bit late, are also being formulated, with the consultations of a global community. So we have the G7, we have the G20. But the United Nations, our Secretary General, has been running this series of conversations on the sort of financing for development, where we have really a much broader global coalition that is coming together and putting forward some of these ideas. And I think that has allowed for us to hear from, Burma and Lesotho and a mix of countries, and has allowed, I think, for some of the solutions to be slightly more comprehensive. And this is an important point. I think the second thing that we have not done well is the vulnerable middle income countries. We have brought them to the table. There are actually even some of them in the G20, but we haven't been able to find enough instruments to respond in a sort of quick enough way to the ails that they have. And I think that one of the things that we have to look at as we get out of this crisis, because there will be more, is to create some kind of an index which allows us, when there is a crisis, to say who are the most hit. I think there's a natural reaction to say, let's go to the low-income countries. But if you look at Seychelles, or if you look at Mauritius, or if you look at, the tourism-prone economies where 70% of their revenues come from tourism and the world is shut down, even if you were well-run, if you lose 70% of your revenue, you get into trouble and you need help immediately. So looking at things like sort of, the catastrophic hurricane instruments that we have in the small island states, can we have some kinds of automatic stabilizers that kick in for economies, but changing the definition of not low-income countries, because I submit that probably Seychelles was more hit by this COVID pandemic than Cote d'Ivoire, because Cote d'Ivoire is an agricultural commodities economy. Commodity prices picked up a little bit, agriculture picked up, and so they maybe did not need as quickly as much help. And so I think we do need to look at that as one of the things we should do. And the third thing, I think, is the response of the multilateral development system, as you've said, in the IFIs, is I think that we're all trying to lean forward. The IMF, of course, did quite an amazing job, but there was always that tension between, if we lean forward, are we going to get recapitalized? And maybe also a global agreement that when we have, shocks of this magnitude, we shouldn't spend a year discussing, am I going to get capitalized if I help Ghana? I think there should be maybe a minimum threshold where we say, 25% or 30% or something, some number is just, you will get a new capital injection based on what you have disbursed. And maybe that can not committed, but disbursed. And maybe that will also create some momentum for the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and others to get some resources out the door much faster.
I think those are all really important points that you've raised, Vera. And I think whether it comes to middle-income countries, where I think we have, the way I think about them is that they weren't rich enough to get to the front of the queue, and they weren't low income enough for somebody to pay for them to get to the front of the queue. So basically, they're kind of left in the back of many queues at the moment. And I do think we need to think about a more structured and forward-leading way of helping them going forward. And I think the issue of tourism-dependent economies, they can be small islands or not small islands, but actually they're
remittance-based economies.
So the ones that have been hit for, and I guess the general point that all this leads to, from everything that you're saying, is that we're definitely in a better place than we were 6 months ago, both objectively, because of the recognition of the common nature of the problem, because of the willingness to address that problem. We're also in a better place because if parts of the world, and if it's actually the larger economies, are growing very rapidly, that alone is good news for the rest of the world, because they're helping to provide an impetus for them. So I think that's better than them being on a slow track. With a little bit of a second order issue around interest rates, I could see Vera sort of getting there. But I think where the challenge, and the way you put it, Ken, and then you've given it much more specific content, Vera, and then coming back to sort of Jean-Paul's intervention earlier, is that this is a turning point, but we still have a hill to climb together. And the fact that we've sort of agreed this is a hill we all have to climb, there's strength in numbers and we can lean on each other, but the hill is still there. And this is going to be a long haul. And the big risk that I see is that as some of the economies and the people get to a point where things look normal, they forget that this is a hill that we all still have to climb together. And this is something that needs to affect our attitude to the IFIs, our attitude to the common goods we're going to face, and also putting in place the systems that will prevent the next crisis, the next pandemic, because surely there will be another pandemic. The question is when, and it may not be as far away as we would hope. That next time we're better prepared, and to do that, we still have to do a lot of groundwork together. So I'm glad that we're at this point compared to where we were 6 months ago. I hope we'll be in a better place still in 6 more months. And Ken, if you're up for it, and Vera, if you're up for it, and Jean-Paul, if you're up for it, what we would like to do is to make an appointment now for us to get together in 6 months and do a stock take on how are we measuring up against our expectations and our worries as we have them today when we get to that point. So with that, let me thank you all for taking the time. Thanks.
But Masood,
Please,
a quick one
please
before you
come on
leave.
it. Come on it. Yep.
I think I'm quite hopeful, and that may be just an African dependence on our mothers, which gives us hope. Because I now look at the landscape, and I see Yeltsin, I see Lagarde, I see Linda Greenstreet, I see Kristalina, I see Gail Smith, I see Susan Rice. Now, women don't give up. So this hill will be climbed.
And we see Vera on the screen as well.
And then, of course, Vera, you know, on the front end of it. So I am hopeful. So it's not a question of 6 months, but what we are going to do in the intervening period, you know,
Absolutely.
this type of support. So yeah, we will continue to fight.
Well, did you remember this? I think it was Christine Lagarde who had this saying that, or it goes. Yeah, I'm trying to recall. I might be getting these two great colleagues and friends having said this, which was that if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters,
right,
maybe we wouldn't have got into the mess that we did. So I think the fact is the world is in a much safer place when women leaders are in charge. I think that
Amen.
And maybe to close, and I just want to come back, we did raise the common framework, but not enough. And I do believe that there will be some countries that will require an orderly debt restructuring and a debt reprofiling. And I think one of the sort of positives maybe coming out of this is hopefully that we're able to get the private sector, the bilateral creditors, and the multilaterals to get together and have a more transparent communication around that. We certainly will be doing a lot more work on the common framework and what it means for countries that are going to need this. We may actually be able to get out of 2021 still, you know, muddling through. But I do believe that it's not, you know, there is, I think, room for an orderly and organized a common framework with a little bit more communication about how it's being done and why it's being done, so that countries that need it should go to it faster, because only then will the recovery also happen.
in the history of debt crises, you can find many examples where a delay in dealing with the underlying problem added to the cost, and the approach of muddling through turned out to have been inadequate. I'm struggling to find any examples where going too quickly to deal with the problem was the issue that we are regretting. So I think that's an important point, and maybe we'll have a separate conversation on that. But with that, recognizing that we're a little bit over time, and with the thanks to all of you for participating in this conversation. Look forward to having another stock take in 6 months, and in the meantime, we wish you well.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.